You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, I'm Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and this is your weekly SLA Insight. I've been talking about these guidelines for creating structured input activities, and I'm going to continue with the next guideline today. But just to get us kind of a running start, to get caught up here, we've been looking at ways to make input, comprehensible input, more carefully crafted so that students can gain more input more intake, from the input that they receive, and hopefully speeding up and making the process more efficient for the student to acquire the language. As we talked about earlier, comprehensible input is essential, but not all comprehensible input is going to be the best for your students. So we're looking at ways to create what are called structured input activities in the context of an approach called processing instruction, which was created by Van Patten, and Andrew Farley helped develop these guidelines for how to create structured input activities that, again, specifically target students to help them derive the most intake from the input that they can, relying on the natural processing strategies that students use, and sometimes working against them to help students speed up or become more efficient at processing. So with that, we're going to look at guideline number 5. We've done 4 so far, and all of the guidelines up to and including today's guideline are guidelines that you can use really for creating any type of input activity. It's number 6 that we'll cover next time that really specifically make these guidelines for creating structured input. But up to this point, these are just some really great rules of thumb for creating any type of input activity. So by quick review, the first guideline is that you present one thing at a time. Second one, keep meaning in focus. The third is that you move from sentences to connected discourse. Fourth, use both oral and written input. And 5, which is what we'll cover today, is that the learners must do something with the input. So looking at this principle, this guideline, how to create input activities, and specifically structured input activities, why do we want to have the learners do something with the input? Well, this guideline is really to prevent a potential pitfall. Input, whether it's listening or reading, is a passive or receptive type of activity. And so it's really easy for the learner to just listen or read and their mind wanders. And so if they do something with the input, they're going to become active listeners, more active readers, and become more focused, more invested, have more of a motivation for paying attention to what's in the input. If the teacher, for example, assigns, just read this book, and I'm giving my students input, well, that's true, but their mind can wander, they may not pay attention, they may not care. But if you're saying, hey, and at the end, you're going to have a comprehension quiz, they're more invested in paying attention to what's going on there. And so this guideline, making the learners do something with the input, again, is just to help correct that and keep learners focused, keep their attention on the material. So again, the remedy for this potential pitfall is to make sure the learner does something with the input. They don't just passively sit there and let it wash over them. But we're not talking output here, especially output of the target form. The learners aren't ready for output at this point, usually, because processing instruction is focused on improving intake for the underlying developing system. And if they haven't received sufficient input and intake for this form, they are certainly not ready to produce output either. So how do we get them to do something with the input if they're not going to produce output with it? Well, here are a few suggestions. One is that you'd use total physical response, or TPR. And this is an approach that I covered several episodes ago, where the student is required to respond in actions. So you give them a command, and what they do with that command is they act it out. They respond to the command. So, for example, put the small rock on the big table. That's a form of something they can do. They don't have to produce output, but they do have to do something with the input, and they're forced to focus on what you're saying, because if they decide to let their mind wander, it's going to be pretty embarrassing when they're like, huh, what? So they need to focus on the input and pay attention so they can do something with it. Several other options kind of fall in the category of multiple choice types of activities. So you might present them with a picture and tell them, okay, which target language word, L2 word, best describes what's going on in this picture. And so if you're teaching verbs, for example, maybe you've got somebody who's sitting there taking a drink or eating something, and you give them several words. One of them's eating, one of them's drinking, one of them's walking, and they have to decide which of those best describes the picture. Or you could reverse it. Give them one word and 3, 4, 5 pictures, and they have to decide which picture best goes with that L2 word that you're trying to get them to learn. Another option, and again, could be multiple choice, but this one could be like a short answer, more along the lines of comprehension. So in this L2 story or sentence you just read or heard, who ate the bread in that story? And so they have to either multiple choice or fill in the blank. Again, just basic comprehension to make sure that they are actually paying attention to comprehending that story or the dialogue that they just heard. Another option here is to create what are more affective type questions that may or may not have a right or wrong answer, but they still force the student to focus on the meaning and do something with the input. So an example of this type of activity would be, which of these two are these, and you might have a whole list, it doesn't have to be 2, it could be 4, 5, 6, which of these L2 sentences describes something you did yesterday? So if you're doing like the perfect tense, for example, or past tense. So it might be like, I ate the fish, I walked to Jerusalem, I sat in a house. Now, some of them will definitely have a right or wrong. If you're not in Jerusalem already or in Israel and you ask them, did you walk to Jerusalem yesterday? The chances are the answer is no. But who knows? They might have eaten fish yesterday. They might have probably did sit in a house yesterday. So these kinds of questions, they're more affective. There's not a clear right or wrong answer to them, but it gets the learner to do something with that input, make a decision, decide what's best, that kind of thing. But it would then still fulfill this guideline that you do something with the input. So what I'm going to do now is present an example here on the screen, and it is going to have, excuse me just a minute, an example of one thing you could do, an example that meets these criteria for structured input activities, the first 5 that we're talking about. And this activity is teaching the call perfect for Hebrew. And it's something that's taught early, so it's assumed that they don't have a lot of Hebrew under their belt. However, it is also assuming for this particular activity that they've already learned the third masculine singular. And so we're now introducing the third feminine singular and asking them to start differentiating between the two. And so this then follows several of, in fact, all but one of the first 5 guidelines that I've introduced so far. So I'm going to read the instructions and then talk about how this meets the criteria. First set of instructions. For each of the following sentences, decide if it is describing something David did or something Ruth did. And in parentheses, hint, look at the verb endings to ensure the subject and verb agree. And second set of instructions, then, using your knowledge of the biblical character, David or Ruth, decide if it is likely or unlikely that he or she actually did the action. So the first question is Amad Babet Lechem. If your Hebrew is not your language, it's he stood in Bethlehem. And then the question is, who did this? And the options are David or Ruth. And so again, we're differentiating, is this a masculine form or a feminine form? And so the first criteria for structured input activities, or input in general, is you only present one thing at a time. And this activity is presenting only the third feminine singular, assuming that the third masculine was already introduced in this series of lessons. So they're only having to differentiate between third masculine and third feminine singular. So that meets the first criteria. The second one is that you keep meaning in focus. And this is what I'm doing with the second set of instructions. You see, if I only stopped with the first, did David or Ruth do it? You could do this activity without understanding the meaning of each sentence. You would only have to look to see what the verb ending is. If it's a third masculine singular, which of course has no ending, then you pick David. If it has the kamatz hey at the end, it's third feminine, and of course you would pick Ruth. You don't have to know what the sentence says. However, by adding the likely or unlikely second set of follow-up questions, it forces them to look at that and go, well, what does it mean? And is this something David or Ruth could do? I'm not sure. I'll have to think about it. And for this one, it could be either. Both of them lived in Bethlehem, so it's likely that David did this. So that meets the first two criteria. The third one is that we move from sentences to connected discourse. Now, in the context of this, we're assuming this is one specific set of instructions within a larger set. And so this is probably at, level 2, where we're moving to a little more complex sentences. So we're along the way. It's not very simple one-word sentences, but we're not into connected discourse. But it's assuming that we're moving us in that direction. Again, this is just one small activity within a larger set. So we're moving from sentences to connected discourse. The one thing this does not do is number 4, use both oral and written input. But it would be easy enough to turn this into an oral activity where the teacher reads the sentence or the students listen to a recording and answer the question based on their listening of the oral input. And then the fifth thing, which we covered today, is that the learners must do something with the input. And so with that, again, they're having to answer a multiple choice question. Is it something David or Ruth did? Is it likely or unlikely that David or Ruth did this? So they're not just reading or listening to the input, they actually have to make a choice of some kind, getting them to focus their attention on the input so they're not just mindlessly letting it wash over them. Okay, so that's one example of how to work with structured input and create an activity that follows thus far the first 5 guidelines. And next week, I'm going to work with the 6th guideline. And I'm going to come back to this example and show how it also meets the 6th criteria, and that is keeping the processing strategies in mind. And that number 6, is what really makes structured input activities and different from other types of input activities. So, quick review. We've been talking about the 6 guidelines. We're at number 5 today of how to create structured input activities, a part of processing instruction, the most important component of processing instruction that's aimed at increasing the quality of comprehensible input to help students derive more intake for their developing system from the comprehensible input that they receive. So next week, we will finish with the 6th guideline, and that it will complete all the guidelines for creating structured input activities. I hope you can join me for that. In the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.